Well, here we are again, mate. These webinars seem to roll around very quickly, don't they?
They do indeed.
So today we're going to be looking at a case study of a real life Jonge client that we're going to call Frank for the purposes today, and just have a look at the various plans that we needed to implement for Frank to get him the best result possible.
Yep.
Before we jump into that though, Ash, is there any timely information or news that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so again, the usual thing, there's not a lot going on at the moment. There's been certainly no changes to the insolvency industry that have happened in the last month or couple of months, really. Most people that know listening in that the ATO is still being very compliant and nice and friendly. So there's really, and we're not seeing huge amounts of increase in activity of creditors chasing through the courts yet. So a lot of the pressure that would normally be coming, we're not seeing at this time of year. And I think just with everything just opening up over the last couple of weeks, I think it'll take some time before that pressure will start to mount again. But one interesting thing that, again, most of the people listening would be aware of, but just in case they're not, the new director identification number regime has come in place. It came into effect on the 1st of November. And it's in the transition period, there's actually sort of 3 different dates that are really relevant. So from the 1st of November, if you become a new director, you may already be a director of another company, but if you become a director of a new entity, then you need to apply for your director identification number within 28 days, and that will apply through to the 4th of April. So if if you're doing a restructure or you're just starting up a new business, any new entity that you become a director of, you've got 28 days from appointment as a director to have registered for your director identification number. If you are a current director, you have through till the end of November next year. So you've got, effectively, it's going to be 13 months to apply for your director identification number. If you don't have it by then, my understanding is that you can be removed as a director. The third date is that for any new directorships after the 5th of April 2022, you will not be able to become a director unless you have a director identification number. So pretty important sort of dates to keep in mind. If you're a current director, then obviously I'd be getting it out of the way sooner rather than later, so you're not caught. But otherwise, it would be get it done. You just need to be mindful of any new structures that clients might be setting up. That anything that's been set from the 1st of November, you must have a director identification number within the 28 days. So that's the main new thing that's come into play, and that's obviously been brought in to try and catch people who are setting up multiple companies and shutting them down, and to try and stop all of the street directors, as some would call them. So hopefully that will have some impact. From that point of view, I think it's a good initiative, but like anything, you've got to keep yourself compliant.
Well, thanks for that, Ashley. A very sort of timely reminder even for those people that knew that was coming in. So today we're going to be talking about a real life client of ours, and we've named him Frank for the purposes of discussion. Could you give us a little bit of background on Frank and what his situation was?
Yeah, okay. So the general story of Frank is that he runs a manufacturing business across multiple states, and he's also got an installation component to that business, which is in the various states as well, mainly all eastern seaboard predominantly. He started falling behind with his creditor payments over the last 18 months. It's a good, solid business, turning over some good money with some good contracts. But, with delays in contracts and COVID and getting staff and shutdowns and all the rest of it, things started getting a little bit hairy. So he set up payment plans, was doing all the right things to try and get back on track, and his debtors wouldn't pay, and that would flow things on. So he set up payment plans, but they kept being broken because his debtors weren't paying on time. ended up with a total of, when we met him, of $4.5 million in total creditors.
Right.
But of that, 25% of it, about 1.2 million, was owed to 5 key creditors. And they were in the phase of stopping payments, stopping supply, and threatening legal action on him when we first met him.
Well, that sounds really serious, actually. And without those 5 key creditors, he probably couldn't keep trading, could he?
No, well, that's exactly right. It was when he came to us, it was certainly a real fear factor that the business was in a real state of crisis. If those suppliers stopped supplying, he was going to be left basically with no business. And obviously the threat of legal action in the current environment was, even within the current environment, was pretty scary.
Right. So before we talk about what did happen, could we just spend a few minutes and talk about what would have happened if the legal action started? Can you run us through what that process looks like?
Yeah, so the debt collection process is probably a lot longer than most people think, but it can also be relatively quick. So, most people know, the phone calls start coming, the emails start coming, the demands for money, send a letter out for demand, all those sort of things start happening and putting pressure on the director. In some of these smaller businesses, you start getting phone calls at 7, 8 o'clock at night because they're trying to track you down. None of that's actually legal process. So it's not part of the legal system of debt collection. That's all the pre-work that happens before that. When the first step legally kicks in is a statement of claim, which is issued on the company, and then the director has, or the company has 28 days to respond. So that's 28 days from when it's issued, when it's served on the company. The 28-day clock starts then. Depending on your state, and which court it's in, there are different rules about what you need to do within certain timeframes. Because we are national with our coverage, I'm not going to go into that today. But effectively, a statement of claim is issued. The director has got 2 choices: to enter into some sort of agreement, which means that it stops there, or he can defend it. If he does neither, then after the 28 days expired, they end up in a position where they can get a default judgment against them for the debt.
Right.
Most people think that that's where it's almost the start of the first step of the process. Then a debtor needs to issue a CSD, creditor stat demand, on the company. At that point now, and that only has 21 days for them to deal with. It either has to again be an agreement of payment plan that everyone's willing to accept, or it's paid out in full. Otherwise, at the end of that 21 days, the company will be deemed to be insolvent. And obviously you think, oh, well, that's the end of the process, but it's actually, there's one more step after that. And that is that once they've got an expired CSD, they then need to go back to court and apply for the winding up of the company under insolvency. Because it's insolvent, they will get that court date, and generally that's 4 to 5 weeks out. Can be sooner, can be longer, and it's at that point that the company will then end up in liquidation. So it's quite a long process. If it's done quickly, it's still about a 3-month process. But if you give it a couple of weeks between each stage, you can easily get out to about 6 months on that process.
Now, as you say, Ashley, that's the normal process. And the idea of a statement of claim is that it gives the debtor the opportunity to dispute that claim. So they may say, no, you didn't supply me what you said you would. That's not fit for my purpose. I don't owe you the money. Now, there are some debts, though, that you just can't dispute. So if you report to the ATO how much you owe, you can hardly then argue that I don't owe you that money because you're the one that's told them.
Yeah.
So the ATO will generally go straight to a creditor's statutory demand. Now, we are seeing more of that with sophisticated creditors, with large corporates. They do have the right to go straight to a creditor's statutory demand, and that only gives the debtor 21 days But the normal process would be, as you've described, statement of claim and then creditors stat demand after that. And I won't go into all the reasons that.
No, well, and I mean, the simple thing is that if the debt can't be disputed, they don't need to go through a statement of claim.
Yeah.
So that's the simple difference between the two.
So look, thanks for that, Ashley. Now, let's say that Frank did nothing, like some directors out there and people under pressure, they just stick their head in the sand.
Yep.
And they focus on running their business and doing what they do day to day, and they take no action. Let's assume that company was just wound up and a liquidator was appointed. What would be likely to happen in that scenario?
So most likely the first thing that would happen is the company would cease trading. The liquidator would shut the doors. They would terminate all the staff and send them all home. And the business would just be shut down and all activity stopped on it that day.
Yep.
That effectively erodes the goodwill of the business pretty much instantly. The equipment would normally be sold off through auction houses, and in Frank's case, because he's got multiple sites, they'd be sold off in different auctions in different states. Obviously, all the employees are sent home, they've lost all their job. Their entitlements, although protected by the government scheme Fair Entitlement Guarantee, may take them months before they get them. And we see a lot of that starting to happen around this Christmas period as well, where it's not managed properly. Landlord obviously loses their tenants. And the director, in this case, because of the size of the debts and the personal guarantees, there's a fair chance he'd be looking down the barrel of bankruptcy on the back of that as well. And potentially an uncontrolled bankruptcy if he kept his head in the sand.
Now, we're not suggesting here for a minute that the liquidator would be doing anything wrong in that scenario. In many cases, it's unreasonable to expect a director to continue to trade a business and take those sorts of risks. And, the normal process is as you described. Assets get sold at auction houses, potentially, at whatever the best price you can get on the day is. And we have seen in the past that sometimes sale on that basis yields a very disappointing result, that you're at the mercy of the market to a large extent. So while that's the normal process, and we see it quite commonly in our work, that would be a bit of a disaster, not only for Frank, but also potentially for the employees, for the landlords, and for other key people that are involved. So Frank's being threatened with this legal action by these key creditors. What sort of state of mind was he in at the time? How was he feeling about it all?
When he first came and sat down with me and one of the strategists, he was a mess. He believed that he had a way through and a way out, but I think with the pressure that was mounting, he didn't think he had time to pull it off. So he was feeling a lot of stress. He was, I remember him saying, I just want to find a way of protecting my home or saving my home. He had young kids still in school, wife, all the rest of it. He just didn't want to lose their home. And really, the panic and the fear that he was dealing with was quite. The stress level was very high. Let's put it that way.
And it's really hard to make good decisions when you're feeling like that. It's all a bit overwhelming. And as you said, Ashley, he thought he was running out of time, and there's probably nothing more precious than time when you are facing those sorts of issues. The more time someone has, the better chances of obtaining a favourable outcome. Would you agree?
Time is absolutely critical. There's things that you can do with 21 days if you've got a CSD, but if you've got 3, 4, 5 months to plan and prepare things, then it gives you a whole lot more options. You can put plan Bs, as you and I have talked about before, in place early, and make sure that there's even just protections in place. You might end up in the inevitable position, but you can put some protections in place for the plan B. And it's just never too early to have those things set up.
I've got to say, I've never had a client complain that he got some advice about plan B too soon.
That's right.
I've heard plenty of times where they've said, if only I'd known the options earlier, I could have done something. But I've never had a person, a professional, send me a client, and then they went back to that referrer and said, you got me some help far too early.
Yeah.
You should have left it to the last minute. Now, you said, Ashley, that Frank had some ideas and some plans if he had time to do it. What were they? What was he thinking about?
Yeah, so he was sort of at I guess, an interesting phase of his life. He'd been running across 3 states during COVID meant that he'd been locked out of his home state for a while and locked in, and he was getting a bit tired of running the business as it was. So he was actually really keen to sell off parts of the business. He wanted to sell off the manufacturing part of the business, and potentially some of the in-store components in different states. So sell them off to other people, and then feed into it for moving forward. So and he wanted to basically get out of being in a multi-state business. He wanted to just come back to working in his home state and stay focused on that and not have to worry about all the issues. But every time he looked at trying to do anything like that, he went, I don't have time to do it, because he'd get another phone call from someone who's going, pay me today or I'm going to shut you down.
Yeah.
So that was really where the big issue was. And then the other issue was, he thought, well, if I'm trying to sell this business, how am I going to get the price I need? So, yeah, if I'm under this much pressure, I can't wait to get the right price.
Yeah. So Frank needs time, right? But his payment plans were already rejected by these key creditors, and they're saying, you know, we're about to go to guns on you. Yeah. How could engaging Jonge help someone in that sort of situation? Isn't it too late?
Yeah, well, no, it's not. The reason why it's not is that, you know, Frank had obviously set up a number of these payment plans. They'd broken, and then the phone calls start getting a bit personal. So by bringing in an external party, you actually take the emotion back out of it. And the name calling and all that sort of rot that goes with it gets taken away, because the focus is more on what's the best result that we can achieve.
Yeah.
Rather than, okay, yeah, I told me this last time, he told me that last time. It's about painting that picture in a non-emotional form way to develop a commercial outcome.
I think also bringing in a third party sometimes can show at least a level of commitment to sort stuff out, that you are trying to deal with it, you're getting some help, you've got these professional people to assist you with it. I do want to work this out. So that makes a lot of sense, Ashley. Take the emotion out of it, start dealing with the issues. So once we were engaged to talk to these creditors, what did we do?
Yeah, so one of the big things is that I've found over the years with a lot of these clients is that the threat of the shutdown is really all the creditors got. So they can talk about liquidating you, bankrupting you, I'm going to destroy everything you've got. Well, the power of that is you got, you know, so when we talk to a creditor, we sort of say to them, well, you've got the power to liquidate this company, but let me tell you what happens if you do liquidate. Because a lot of the time they don't know. And rightfully so, they don't know, because they don't have visibility inside the company. Yep. So if we liquidate the company, the assets sell, blah, 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 your return would be X. Now, X is often close to zero, particularly in an uncontrolled format. So when you can actually show with enough evidence and enough detail that that's what's going to happen if they do it, you can then go, so that's your worst case scenario. Let's go back a couple of steps and let's talk about getting you a commercial outcome that's going to achieve more than zero. And then the threat of liquidation becomes less powerful, when really, if you want to liquidate me, mate, you're going to get nothing. If you do it my way, you could get 25 cents in the dollar, 30 cents in the dollar, or you could get paid in full over time. So that's a big part of how we do things. And that's how we get to sort of negotiate ways through. The other thing that we did was that we talked to them about the fact that we were looking to sell parts of the business off. Right. Now, Frank hadn't done that because he didn't think he was going to be able to get there in time. But when we talked to him about, if you buy us time, well, give us time, we can then get this business sold. That'll increase your likelihood of getting paid. as well as you're going to have an ongoing client in the future because you can supply the new business that we'll be doing, the new owners, similar thing to what we're already doing now.
Yeah.
So that really opened the door for us to have some reasonable conversations with them.
Now, as you're saying, importantly, often the creditor doesn't know what return they're going to get because they don't know what the level of secured creditors are that are going to get paid before an unsecured creditor. They don't know what the employee entitlements, which also have a priority over unsecured creditors, might be. So they might be sitting there looking at the business from the outside and thinking that there's plenty of money there to pay them. He just doesn't want to, not realising that money, that other parties have priority for payment before they get their cut. So
absolutely, yeah.
Now, I know that our team can be very persuasive, Ashley, and there's probably no one at the Jonge more persuasive than your good self.
Well, that's calmed down a little bit.
And I'll tell you what, you could sell ice to the Eskimos, I think. But, and I know that we back up everything we say with facts and figures. There's no motherhood statements here. There's no fluff. We evidence the things we're saying. So once we've done all that and we've used all of the skills that we have at our resource, did the creditors end up agreeing to the deal?
Well, it wouldn't be much of a case study if they didn't, Phil. But
it'd be quick, wouldn't it? We'd be done in 20 minutes.
Look, it wasn't. I was involved in a number of them personally, and there were some serious battles, but we were able to get those 5 creditors to play along with Frank for a bit longer as we worked our way through it.
Right.
So, it certainly bought Frank the time for us to then look at doing some of the other things that we needed to do. So everyone did come on board eventually.
And that'd be an outcome that Frank just wasn't in a position to achieve because he'd broken commitments before and they'd already rejected his plans. And it's not uncommon that things get a bit personal. No one likes someone not paying them when they're supposed to. So now we've bought Frank a little bit of time, and that's a precious commodity. How did we spend that time?
Yeah, there were 2 main areas that we focused on. First one was that we introduced Frank to a business broker that we do a lot of work with, particularly trying to sell businesses relatively quickly and making sure that we get it to market in a way that will actually get people interested straight away. And the other was that we put together some work on his personal asset protection strategy, because he was very focused on obviously protecting the family home.
So why was it so important that we protect the family home, Ashley? What's the big deal?
Well, there are a couple of things. That come into, well, for him, because he was in that sort of semi-construction industry, there are a lot of people who had capital interests and personal guarantees. And even though we bought some time, there was still a risk. There was still a lot of risk floating around with the business as we went through stuff. So, if those personal guarantees could attack his house, then obviously that would head the wrong way and he could end up in bankruptcy. If he ended up in bankruptcy, then the trustees got an interest in the equity of the property and that interest vests with the trustee. Which then obviously makes it very difficult to keep a property if the wife's got half and the trustee's got the other half.
Now, we did get a question, but we might just finish off on talking a little bit about the house before we address that.
Yep.
Now, I know we've spoken about this before, but for the benefit of our new guests today, can you just talk through how do you go about protecting a home from the claim of a trustee in bankruptcy?
Well, in Frank's case, it was the equity in the home we wanted to sell to the wife, so the equity in the home. So we at the fair price. So we had to get a valuation done on the home, independent valuation done on the home. We got the latest mortgage statements, and then the gap between those two obviously is the equity. Half of that belonged to Frank. And then, so we then helped with solicitors' help, we then entered into a deed of equity for the wife to purchase that equity off Frank. Frank's wife made the payment and then started making all the payments on the mortgage. And we set up the structure so that she could pay him over a period of time for his equity.
Right.
And then, and one of the important things, again, we've talked about in other webinars, is that she has to have the ability to fund the mortgage moving forward and pay it out of her wages. And she did have a job outside the business structure that allowed her to do that.
Now, we might just pause for a moment and just take a question from Philip. He must be a good bloke with a name like Philip. Are you answering this one, Ash, or am I?
Mate, it's all yours.
Well, I believe the question is, how long can creditors pursue a debt? Is there a statute of limitation? Now, I'd need to look up the exact answer, but I believe that it's over 6 years. But with leave of the court, it could even potentially be longer if an action is at least commenced. So they can go back a long time and chase these debts. I want to say it's 6 years and 6 months, but I'm not a lawyer, and I'd need to look it up, but it is a considerable period of time that a creditor can still enforce.
I can see Gab nodding her head, and I know that she deals with that a lot. So it looks like you're pretty close to the mark there, Phil. 6 years.
6 years. Well, that's pretty good. All right, now back to our case study. So now you've bought some time, you use that time to protect the house. So if everything went wrong for Frank, he's got a little bit of a safety net under him so that it won't be as hard a landing as it otherwise might be. But Ashley, you said earlier that Frank was worried that the proceeds from the sale of the business wouldn't be enough to pay out all his creditors.
Yep.
What's changed there? How does this now work?
Well, it hasn't changed completely, except that there's a better understanding now. So in really simple terms, we still believed that the company was going to need to go into liquidation. And most people, when they're trying to sell a business, when they're in this duress state, they're trying to sell it for a price that's going to cover their debtors, their creditors.
Creditors, yeah.
So they want to sell it for $4.5 million in this case, because that's the total creditors. And if I'm lucky, I'll get a bit more for myself. But that's not necessarily the value of a business. The business isn't valued at 4.5 just because there's 4.5 worth of creditors. So we were able to talk to him about how we can actually look at selling the business for a price that was the market price, and then we would deal with the unsecured creditors as part of the liquidation process.
Right.
So we were able to separate that out, and so therefore we could put the bits on the market that we wanted to get the best possible price, not a price that was just there to pay creditors.
So I think a lot of times owners end up getting handcuffed to their businesses because they think they need to sell them for an amount that the market just won't pay. So by dealing with some unsecured creditors through the insolvency process, you can actually turn an unsaleable business into a saleable business and just ask the price that it's worth, that the market will actually pay. So we spoke at the start that Frank thought he was going to lose everything, his business, his house, he was really stressed and depressed and probably pretty scared. Let's fast forward a little bit. Tell us what happened.
Sorry, Phil, I was just reading a question that came through on the direct message, so the other wouldn't see it, but I will come back to that question.
Okay. I was asking you what ended up happening. We've introduced, we bought some time, we got him a broker. He thought he was going to do the lot. What was the reality?
Yep. So we were actually able to, the broker did a fantastic job in a really short space of time, and was able to, we were able to get the components that we wanted sold. So we found a purchase, entered into an appropriate sale agreement, did all of that. And then that part of the business was sold off. The part that Frank wanted to keep, we took that through a process of doing a restructure for Frank. So we got that valued, plant and equipment valued that he was buying, the goodwill valued for that part that he was buying, and entered into a sale agreement to do that as well through a restructure. And he was left with that one part of the business that he wanted.
Yep.
The other businesses got sold off, and then we moved into a smaller scale structure for what he wanted to do moving forward. So it worked well.
So we've spoken about this many times before. talking about a restructure, and we'll say again that that's completely legal as long as you pay a fair market price for whatever it is that you buy.
Yeah.
Right? As normal, we help get valuations of goodwill and plant and equipment to evidence that he was paying a fair price for it. And the new entity then paid for those assets over a period of time.
Yep.
So again, completely legal. In reality, paying fair market value can be a lot different than selling a piece of equipment at an auction house on any given day.
Yeah, yeah.
You're also
and there's
getting
a goodwill component, Phil. So
you're getting paid for the goodwill. So for creditors, that means that you're maximising the return from the sale of that local installation business that Frank wanted to keep. And they're actually getting a better result than they would if that company just went into liquidation in an uncontrolled manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before you move on, the next question we've got Wayne's might be a little bit more update just to us that there was a very recent decision by the High Court that a house in the wife's name can be considered jointly owned by husband and sold to meet company debts. How does that affect home protection strategies going forward? Now, first thing I'm going to say is I haven't read the case, so I have to look at the circumstances specifically because over the years, I've certainly seen, and Phil might comment on this as well, a lot of people who thought that they had the house in the wife's name. They didn't think they had the house in the wife's name. The house was in the wife's name, but the husband was paying the mortgage. So then that created an equitable interest. Or it could be that the house, that their company was paying for it and all that sort of stuff. So there's a whole lot of issues around individual circumstances. So I can't answer Wayne's question directly, although it looks like he's just sent me through the link, so I'll have a read of it.
Yep.
And we'll, if there's any update, as you all know, listening in, we're the first ones to give updates on any change in ruling and change in strategies. But I think what we've seen in the past is that quite often there are a lot of circumstances about getting it right and the structuring and the ongoing maintenance of it that isn't often covered off correctly. And that's part of what we do with the asset protection strategies. And
I just say, when it comes to court decisions, we need to have a look into this because each case will be different, determined on the facts. And it'll depend on the specific circumstances for that case. Now, there was recently 2 cases determined, which was arguing around the equity of exoneration, that said that, if a debt's incurred solely for the benefit of one party, it should be paid from that party's share first. And there were 2 cases at face value looked very similar, and the decisions went opposite ways. In one case, the equity argument was upheld, and in another, it was rejected. So we'll have a look into that, and maybe if we have some insights into it, we can put something up on our website or come back to Angelo individually. Now, my friend Philip's asked another question.
He has, yes. He, obviously, you two get on with that same name.
We get on great. We're good people. And I think it was, can we run through how I've lost it for a moment, but can we run through how the restructure process works? So basically, as we've said, it's quite okay to sell a business or a component of a business to a new trading entity. The critical issue is, are you paying a fair price for it? Are you paying the right money? So what you need to do is identify the goodwill, which is attributable to that business or division of that business. And that's often a function of the recurrent revenue or the profit potential after adjustment for directors' wages and finance costs and things like that. So you go to an accountant or to a specialist valuer and you ask for a goodwill valuation. What's this business worth in the market for me to go and run so that I can start making that money instead of Ashley, for example? You then identify any plant and equipment that you're going to need to be able to run that business. And you go to a valuer and you get a formal valuation of that equipment. Now, valuers will often give you a range of valuations, which will be anything from forced sale value or liquidation value right through to fair market value. Now, to be compliant with the legislation, you must pay fair market value if you want to do that legally and you want to sell that to a related party. So now I know what the goodwill's worth. I know what the assets are worth. So now I know what I've got to pay. I then get a solicitor to draw up a sales contract, which will specify the terms of payment, any conditions that go with it. That could include things like any workout clauses for benchmarks or milestones relating to retaining clients or whatever. It could also include vendor finance arrangements so that the purchasing entity can pay that debt off over a period of time. So once I've done that, I've signed the contract. It's then time to comply with the terms of that contract in terms of payment, whether that's a lump sum payment up front or whether that's payment under vendor finance over a period of time. So the new company now needs to go and pay it to the old company. I should point out that any security interests that are applicable to either the business overall or the assets must be dealt with. You can't pass clear title to an asset if, for example, that vehicle's under finance to Toyota Finance. You've got to get Toyota Finance to consent to the sale or remove their finance charge before you can pass clear title. So now money goes back over to the vendor company and it needs to distribute the money that it has available to it according to security and priority interests and be able to account for those sales proceeds. I'll say if this old company goes into liquidation before the vendor finance payments have been completed, the remaining payments become payable to the liquidator and will vest with the liquidator if it hasn't been paid for in full. So I hope that answers that question. But of course, anyone that would like to discuss the process of doing a restructure in greater detail, Ashley and I will be hanging around for a little while afterwards, and we're more than happy to talk to you offline and just run you through how that all works.
Yeah, Phil, while you were telling your story, which I knew you'd be correct, so I was trying to do two things at once, which meant I wasn't listening to you.
Never do.
I had a quick read of the case that someone graciously put a link up to,
yeah.
and I've got to say this is exactly what we're talking about, where bad asset protection is done. There was an original deposit of $250,000 that came from a joint account put in to purchase the property.
Right.
Then the property was transferred into one name solely with no representation for the purchase of the equity. The husband then used the house to borrow money to put into other activities. If I'd looked at that, I would have said to your client it wasn't protected anyway. So from if it's the same case that we're talking about, that's exactly what we discuss about being bad protection from the start. And I'll once again say it, moving a house into a wife's name or into the non-risk spouse's name just to get it out of the way will never, ever work.
No.
To me, that's not a remarkable case at all. That's actually, I'm not saying it's the same one. I need to do some more research with Wayne and the one that was put through. But that's completely unremarkable. And in this case, the ATO was able to claim that the house was half the husband's. I would have completely agreed with that. We see way too often people recommend moving the house into the wife's name. The only thing that does is potentially stops caveats. It does not get rid of the equitable interest in the property at all. And therefore, the claim against that does not go away.
So the title deed's just the name on the title deed's the legal interest in the property. The equitable interest is a totally different beast. So unless you address the equitable interest in the property, it is not going to be protected from a trustee in bankruptcy or from the sort of claim that the ATO's made based on what Ash has read.
Yeah. Certainly that's a 2-second version of a male reading while someone else was talking right in front of us. So I don't pretend to be that smart.
All right. So as we said, Ash, back at the start, Frank was feeling helpless and scared. He thought he was going to lose everything. We helped him get some time, but then importantly, we used the time that we got in an effective way. We spoke briefly about what happened in this case, but what was the end result for Frank?
So, as I mentioned, for Frank, he was able to sell off the parts of the business that he wanted. He kept a smaller local part of the business for himself. When the money was received for the sale, we were able to use that to deal with paying out secured creditors. We paid down superannuation that was outstanding and other employee entitlements for the employees that weren't continued on in either of the two businesses. The lease premises were taken over by the purchasing entity, all kept with himself in his new business. So all the leases were kept on, which then protected against the personal guarantees. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, the majority of the staff were actually re-employed in one of the two businesses. So that we was able to keep that ongoing nature for the staff. At the end of the day, he's got a business that's the size that he's comfortable with to continue making a living and feed the family and look after the family.
Yep.
The wife's now the full owner of the property under the deed. She's paid him out in full for that. And we've now put the original company into liquidation to deal with the remaining creditors of the company.
Right. But Frank's still going to have to go bankrupt though, right? He's got personal guarantees and some people didn't get paid.
Yeah, well, possibly, but we actually think it's less likely now than it was now that we've done what we've done, because we have been able to pay down a number of the creditors along the way. But you're right, there are still significant creditors left behind. Mm-hmm. The difference now, though, is because we put the asset protection strategy in, most of the creditors that are chasing under the personal guarantee, we've talked with, there's a couple who we're still talking with, but most of them, we've actually been able to do a deal to settle, because once again, their power is in bankrupting him. And if we can show that the power of bankrupting is not going to achieve any result, they may not want to spend the $8,000 or $10,000 to bankrupt someone. Mm-hmm. So then doing a commercial settlement to settle them out and keep them out of bankruptcy is still a valid option and something that he wants to pursue. So it looks like we're getting pretty close to being able to avoid bankruptcy for him completely.
Now, we've got a couple of more questions, but we might just finish off our case study and then come back and address those in a minute.
Yep.
So if you look at Frank's situation, plan A was continue to trade your way through COVID, put up with all the hassles of that, and just trade your way out of your problems. But as we discussed earlier, that just wasn't working. Plan B was to negotiate with the creditors and get a little bit of time to work on a strategy that's going to protect Frank and help him get a better outcome. Plan C was to protect the family home so that we had a safety net in a worst case scenario. And plan D was to do the sale of the interstate businesses and to do a restructure of the local installation business. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if I get to plan Z. It doesn't matter how many plans I need. And it's all about trying to get the best result for the client. It can all work out and you can get a great result as long as you have the time to implement a comprehensive strategy. I take it you'd agree with that, Ash?
Completely. Yeah, time is definitely your friend in these things.
All right.
Yeah.
So I think at the end of the day, we exceeded all of Frank's expectations on what he thought that he might be able to achieve by getting that professional advice, and if you've got time, using it for your best advantage.
Oh, and look, you know, he is certainly in a much happier place. The stress is gone. Even with these last couple of creditors we're dealing with, it's you know, it's not the fear anymore. Like, even if he does have to go bankrupt, there's not the fear of that, because he understands that it's not the end of the line for him going bankrupt. He can still move forward. So yeah, he's just in a much happier, re-energized place, ready to get on with the business he's got left, the smaller, and really making that work for what he wants it to do. So yeah, it's a fabulous result.
All right. Any final words before we go and answer some questions for our friends here?
Yeah. Well, how about we jump into the questions before we'll go the other way around. So we've got to play a bit of catch up here. Phil's on the rampage.
So the question from Philip was, So this will be done at arm's length, I expect, and would you recommend selling to a related party? Well, when we talk about arm's length, I'd use the term that it's all done for full fair market value, that everything's sold at market value. So that sounds arm's length to me to an extent, right? It doesn't matter. I would recommend selling to a related party if that's what the client wanted to do. If he wanted to retain ownership of the business and continue to trade it, I've got no problem selling to a related party as long as I sell for full market value, and I'm doing it all at a fair price. It's all documented and it's supported by valuations. The creditors are going to get a better outcome than that. The next question
was, cash is paid.
And cash is paid. There's real consideration. Changes hands. I'll also point out that as employee entitlements have a priority over unsecured creditors, as long as the secured creditors dealt with, you can offset any employee entitlements assumed by the purchasing entity against the purchase price of the business. So if I re-employ the staff and I say, I'll pay you your annual leave, your long service leave, whatever it might be, not super, just employee entitlements, I can offset that against the purchase price of the business, and there's no problem with that.
Yep.
The next question we had was relating to that court case again about the husband and wife and the equity in the property. So how would it be done properly? Well, what Ashley and I would have done when we first looked at that was determined what the equitable interests in the property were at that time. Not what the legal interest was, but what the equitable interest was. And we would have valued that property, got evidence of the mortgage or secured debt against that property, assessed the amount of equity there, assumed if the deposit came from a joint account in the absence of other information, we would assume that the husband had 50% equity in that property, and we would have sold his interest to his wife for fair commercial consideration. Now, in this instance, so Frank's wife had full ownership of the family home via a family trust. No trust involved, but she had full ownership of the home. As Ashley said in our case study, in this instance, we transferred the title deed into the wife's name to prevent the lodgement of caveats on it. Again, that's a legal interest thing. That's not an equitable interest thing. Frank's wife actually achieves full ownership of the home by buying his equity from him and paying him real money for it. So she actually acquired.
And continuing to pay the mortgage.
And paying the mortgage from her own resources.
Yeah. So one thing I want to be really clear for everyone on is that we're getting quite specific here because of the case and obviously our case study, but every single one of these is quite unique in the way people have done it.
Yep.
You know, the case that I read, there was a deposit that came from a joint account, and that means it changes things again from if it was the money came from her, the wife's account originally. When they transfer it, how they use the money afterwards. So we're talking general terms here. And, you know, if you've got a specific case you'd like to talk to us about, more than happy to do that.
Yep.
Yeah, so just so that I think we've caught up on the questions.
Good crowd this afternoon, Ashley. They got lots of good questions for us. I like that.
Yep, absolutely. So I guess we'll come. Well, we've actually gone well and truly into our time, so we'll wrap up pretty quickly. You can read that question while I play wrap up, Phil. So I guess to finish up, I think one of the things that we really wanted to get across in this case study is that in the current marketplace around Australia, things are actually pretty laid back at the moment. We know that there's a lot of debt out there. A lot of businesses are holding on to stuff that holding on to a lot of creditors. The creditors aren't chasing them. So therefore, they're actually giving themselves significant amount of time and they're getting away with a lot. Because there's no pressure from the ATO, the banks are being nice, the state revenue officers are being nice, and creditors generally are being nice as well, we've got a real situation at the moment where we believe that there are some businesses that are at risk that are not taking the decisions correctly now or looking at plan Bs. Now, plan B doesn't mean you do all of what we've done in Frank's case study. It may be just talking about it because there's still a lot of optimism. There's a lot of optimism that a business, now that it's out of lockdown, or, I was talking to a client in Queensland the other day where it's actually gone the other way. They're worried that they're going to go into lockdowns when the country opens up. So there's fear, there's hope and fear at the same time at the moment. But if someone's making decisions without knowing what their options are, particularly if they're under some level of pressure, then they're not necessarily making the best decisions. So talking to your clients about what plan B options are available doesn't mean you implement it. And I'll give you a simple example. As I met with a client yesterday, he's got what I would consider a significant amount of tax debt. It's over $400,000. But for the last 9 months, or last 18 months, but 9 months particularly, he's been under enormous stress going through a really horrible marriage breakup and divorce. That got settled last week. Wanted to come down and sit down with me this week and say, what do I do now? But he didn't even know if he wanted to run the business. He didn't even know if he wanted to build it back up. He knows that in good times, the business can certainly do enough to pay that money back quickly. So talking him through what we could do with the tax debt if the business doesn't improve in February, for instance, we know what we can do, but he needs time to think about it. So he knows his plan B is that we can actually deal with it. If he gets a director penalty notice, if he gets anything, come and see me straight away and off we go. But otherwise, he's got time now to think about it, and any decision he makes, he can make knowing what another outcome option is. So I think that's really what we wanted to try and talk about or show in this case study. I will wrap up now because we have run over. As much as I hate to say this, this is our last for the year. So therefore, I need to say Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to those that I don't speak to. We figured that everyone would be too busy at Christmas parties in December. So it's way too early for me to be saying Merry Christmas, but I won't see some of you online again. So I wish you all the best for the Christmas and New Year. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks again, Phil. We will stay online now for 10 minutes for anyone who wants to stay on. There are a few questions that have popped up now, so if those guys want to stay on, we can do that. Elise is going to make you hang around for another 30 seconds and say either nice or bad things about us with our feedback. And then really appreciate everyone's time. And those who want to hang around and go through the rest of the questions can. Those who need to go, once again, we really appreciate your time. So, Phil, did you get to read what about we're leaving a business voluntarily?
Oh, I got this one, mate. So it's a really good question. Really good question from Dominic. And it's about if you're leaving a business voluntarily and you're selling your shares to the other business owners or existing directors, shareholders, how do I remove my personal director guarantee so any future debts are only guaranteed by the remaining directors and I won't be chased for future debts incurred? It goes on to say that the business has got no problems right now. So that's a really good question, and it's one that's commonly overlooked when people are looking to exit a business. Now, for those that know me, you'll probably know that I worked for a major bank for a little while, but only 29 years. And what we're talking about here, what we would advise someone in that position to do would be to do what's called determining their guarantee. Determining a guarantee means that you say, I'm liable for the amount of debt outstanding today, but no more. It's like drawing a line in the sand and saying, that's it. Whatever's owed at today, I'm liable for that. That should be done in writing. Then if the creditor continues to provide credit to the company, the payments that the company makes off its existing debt is the repayment of an old debt, and credit that's granted from that point on is the creation of a new debt. So over time, it'll go like that. The old debt will get repaid the one that the exiting director has signed for, and as credit is supplied and goods or product or whatever is supplied, the new debt will be created that director hasn't guaranteed. The only other way to do it, other than determining your guarantee, and the legal concept that I've outlined for you there, and the repayment of a debt is payment on an account is a repayment of an old debt, and credit on an account is the creation of a new debt, is what they commonly in a shorthand refer to as the rule in Clayton's case. It goes back to a really old court case. So over time, you can effectively cycle the guaranteed debt out for debt that has not been guaranteed. The only other way to achieve an outcome that protects the outgoing director is to go to that creditor, terminate the old credit agreement and sign a brand new one. So you terminate one and you sign a brand new one. The new guarantee supersedes the old guarantee. Now, I actually had a case with a very large business. It was turning over $50 million a year, where the director had left many years before I met that client, and they'd not done that. And that client, the company ended up going into liquidation, and the director that had resigned some 3 years earlier was pursued under personal guarantees for all the debt outstanding to creditors because they'd not dealt with their personal guarantee when they left.
Yeah, I had a family of 4. I think we talked about when we talked about this issue. Four brothers, 3 of them left.
Mm-hmm.
Our client ended up being the 4th one, and they'd been out of the business 5 years. And then we had to liquidate them, and then some of the old guarantees got pursued.
Yeah, so it's a dangerous scenario. I actually used that strategy in a partnership dispute as well, where you had multiple directors, and I basically had 2 directors ganging up against the other director. They wouldn't pay him any dividends, they wouldn't give him any money, and he was linked in under guarantees. Now, this company had a pretty significant monthly cash cycle, and I think it was the first week of the month, their bank overdraft was virtually nil. And at the end of their month, their bank overdraft was about $750,000. So he determined his guarantee in the first week of the month when the overdraft was nil, which meant that he wasn't responsible for that increase in overdraft because he had determined his guarantee.
Yeah.
The other 2 directors didn't like me very much, but my client thought it was great.
Yeah, so sometimes you don't make friends everywhere, do we? If anyone's got any other questions, you're more than happy to unmute yourself or put your hand up, and then I'm not sure if Elise has to unmute you or you can do that. But I know for myself, by the time I type a question, I've lost interest in the question. So if anyone wants to speak, they're more than welcome to do that. We were going to try and come up with some dad jokes for this time, Phil, but we're not real good at those. So
I told you a couple and you just groaned at me, so I think I'll leave it there.
I think we have well and truly run over. We're into the 3 o'clock session. So look, I think it's interesting. I know some people joke about me calling it interesting times. But I think the next 6 to 12 months are going to show certainly some very significant issues for a lot of businesses, and it will be interesting to see how it all plays out. As I say, I think Phil's over in Western Australia, so their fear starts next year when they finally allow us back in and we bring the disease back in. And Queensland's got the same issue. Whereas, Victoria, New South Wales, we'll live with it. So that will impact businesses and I don't think any of us really know how. So it will be interesting to watch. But look, guys, what I want to be really clear on is please use us as a resource. If you've got a situation that you're talking to a client about, or something you've seen happen, more than welcome to just pick up the phone, talk to Phil or I or any of the strategist team, and we'll be more than happy to he will. Sorry, Phil. I was trying to work out who Mark was. We call him the supreme leader over here, mate. Yeah, we're more than happy to talk about any scenario like that. Case study is a really interesting example of, there's all this furor about how you've got to redo everything. Well, that was never done right in the first place. So, so looking at making sure it's done the right way. And I think the big trick with when we look at asset protection for Phil and I, particularly, and Hank, we're coming from an insolvency in an insolvency view of it. So you can look at asset protection from a legal point of view. You can look at asset protection from an accounting point of view, but we're looking at it from the insolvency point of view. So what works against the trustee? What works against the liquidator? And sometimes they don't necessarily go together. So then you've got to manage the risk profile. I'm working with an accountant at the moment who's got a client with a massive portfolio of assets and businesses, and they've asked us to do a risk profile from what happens if something falls over somewhere. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to change the structure to what I think it should be, because there are tax consequences, there are other consequences that all come into play. And at some point, you've got to marry them all off against each other. So it's about looking at and being informed in those options.
Ash, I had one client that had gone to his solicitor and paid quite a significant sum of money to put this arrangement in place where his wife bought the property from him. He did a vendor finance agreement with her. And then shortly after that, he forgave the debt. And I said to him, mate, that's not going to work. The trustee's going to shred that.
Yeah.
And he said, no, my solicitor reckons this is the way to go. I said, well, you're going to have a talk to him and tell him you're about to go bankrupt. So he went back to the solicitor and said, so I paid you, I'm not going to say the number, what he paid him, but it was a bloody good number. And he said, this thing I paid you to do for me, I'm about to go bankrupt. I've got no problems. He says, oh, no, that won't work in bankruptcy. Okay. We do see some very complicated schemes about, the use of trusts or debt forgiveness or whatever. The simple things in life are often the best and the most effective against claims from insolvency practitioners, right? If you don't do it the right way, you can be as clever as you like. And we've got some very clever people out there, I don't doubt that. But the law is on the insolvency practitioner's side, and they're clever people too. And unless you've paid real money for it, the most convoluted schemes in the world are not going to protect that property from an insolvency practitioner.
No. All right, well, we'll wrap up there. Unless there's any, it's great to catch up with you all again, and thank you for listening in.
Good fun crowd this afternoon.
Yeah, a lot more we had to think today, Phil.
Yeah.
And I look forward to catching up with everyone, hopefully before Christmas, or if not in the new year. But we've still got a long way to Christmas. So I do hope to catch up with most of you at some point soon.
Yeah, it's time to go back a winner in the Oaks.
Well, if you know a winner, let us all know. Yeah.
All righty, thanks a lot.
Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.